Hello again. My name is Steve Hillis, and we've been discussing major sociological theories. In particular, we've been discussing functionalism. We now turn to the organism metaphor. When Emil Durkheim first began to develop functionalism, he made very clear that he believed that society was like a great organism. Now, maybe that sounds a little bit like a bad fortune cookie. Society is like an organism. But if you think about it just a little bit, actually it's a pretty rich metaphor, and it certainly captured a lot of the arguments and assumptions that Durkheim was making or holding. Well, what did he mean by society being organic or being like an organism? Well, he was suggesting that really we're kind of all cells in a great body, cogs in a great machine, if you will. He was suggesting that just like an organism, society is made up of specialized systems and subsystems, parts that all work together to keep the whole system working, thriving, surviving. Our major institutions, our large organizations, and for that matter, I guess our small organizations as well, are typically highly specialized, just like organs in a body. Just like our body has hearts and livers and intestines and our nervous system and so forth, each specialized in doing critical functions to keep us alive and keep us moving and thriving. Well, society also has specialized institutions, all sorts of organizations that focus on one kind of activity or another kind of activity that are critical to make everything work properly. And for this overall social system to work properly, everything has to work in sync. Everything has to be properly coordinated. And just like an organism, society has to sometimes deal with malfunctions, dysfunctions, breakdowns, things falling apart, things not working. Durkheim really was suggesting a lot of things about society when he talked about society being an organism. He was suggesting that the societies adapt. The world, the social world and the physical world, are always changing. Societies are constantly suffering various kinds of shocks or challenges or problems. And societies constantly have to evolve and adapt and adjust. Because those societies that don't ultimately struggle and sometimes die off. Vibrant societies, healthy societies, have to be flexible enough to be able to constantly adjust to changing conditions. He was also suggesting that societies are deeply interconnected, that they're, well, interdependent. Everything is attached to everything else. You change one part of society, you change other parts of society. One part of society breaks down, other parts of societies change. Sometimes they suffer other breakdowns. But a lot of times, when one part of society breaks down, other parts of society change in ways to minimize the damage, to compensate, to adjust. More generally, if you change one part of society, you often change many other parts of society. Why? Because everything is like a web tied together. Each part of society doing its own little thing to keep everything going properly, and if you change one part, you almost inevitably change other parts. Interdependence, interconnectivity, everything tied together. At the same time, he believed that societies were typically self-repairing and self-correcting. Now, Durkheim and other functionalists didn't believe that societies didn't have problems or break down. They knew they did. But they believed that problems, a wide range of social problems, were typically solved by most societies in most cases. Societies heal their own wounds. They tend to repair themselves just like a living organism. If one part of society begins to break down, other parts of societies, again, try to compensate. For example, let's say you have a breakdown in the educational system. Well, maybe educational functions are then taken up by other parts of society. The military begins to train their troops, providing various kinds of education that in a different period might have been provided in schools. And it might not just be the military, but could be universities providing education that had been provided in high school. It could be internet education. It could be all sorts of other groups, organizations, and institutions kind of taking over some of the functions that the educational institution wasn't really getting done properly. More generally, if one part of society changes, almost inevitably you see many, many other changes. Just a couple quick examples. When you introduce the automobile and mass transportation, think about how that changed everything else. Cities became larger and more spread out. We got shopping centers. More and more people began to work farther and farther away from where they lived. And kids got more freedom, more time away from mom and dad, more cruising in cars, and well, sometimes doing things in the back seats of cars that would have astounded their parents. Introduction of mass transportation and automobiles changed everything. You could do a similar kind of exercise thinking about how more recently the introduction of the internet has changed so many things about how society works in all sorts of ways. And it's not just changes in technology, changes in venereal diseases and changes in medication for venereal diseases have changed our sexual culture, our families, how many children people have, how many people get married. And that in turn has changed many other aspects of society. I could go on endlessly, but just stop. The point is you change one part of society and ultimately you often change many other parts. Why? Because society is so interconnected, so interdependent, so, well, organic. Now, Durkheim also believed that society, just like an organism, did require large-scale coordination and cooperation. The parts had to work together. Something had to coordinate social activity, get people to cooperate, get the left hand and the right hand working in the same direction, or at least working in complementary ways. That was an intensely difficult problem. Maintaining functionality, social solidarity, social cohesion, keeping society tied together and working properly was a never-ending task. And when it broke down, things could go terribly wrong. Think about it, I don't know, like you're conducting a symphony orchestra. If one part of the orchestra is playing at a little different pitch or a little different tempo than another part of the orchestra, even a single instrument isn't performing its task in coordination with everybody else, well, the music begins to break down and sound pretty bad. And if the problem's spread, then pretty soon it doesn't even sound like music anymore. It's chaos, it's noise. Well, that musical metaphor kind of captures what Durkheim was getting at when he talked about organic metaphors. Sorry for using a metaphor to explain another metaphor, but you can switch. You can talk about society being like an orchestra or society being like a great machine. But if you were Emile Durkheim, you would have talked about society being like a great organism. And hopefully, many similar ideas are captured by several different metaphors. At the same time, Emile Durkheim believed that societies tend to seek balance. They tend to seek equilibrium, like a living organism. Your blood pressure tends to maintain a certain range depending on your level of activity and so forth. You get up, well, your blood pressure has to rise as you get up in the morning. Otherwise, you feel dizzy, you fall over, you're sluggish. Well, your body has to constantly adapt or keep working at maintaining that comfortable, functional level of blood pressure. If your blood pressure rises a little bit too quickly, your body tends to kind of force it down. If it falls a little much for some reason, your body actively works to pick it up. It tries to keep it in a comfortable range. Your body temperature is the same way. Your body basically tries to make sure that you don't get too hot or too cold. It keeps you within a fairly narrow range of temperatures, and it constantly works at doing that. Well, according to Emile Durkheim, societies are kind of the same way. They actively try to maintain equilibrium, balance in their social functions. Keep things within a useful range. Not too much, not too little. For example, according to Emile Durkheim, we actually need crime. I know that sounds crazy, but he claims you can have too little of it. Now, I don't want to get too much into that because we will talk about that later in class, and frankly, we've already kind of hinted at that when we talked about functional logic. But for right now, I just want to point out that Durkheim suggested that you could have too little crime, but he also knew that you could obviously have way too much crime or the wrong kinds of crime. So, the trick for Durkheim was that society keeps enough crime to support our criminal justice system, to promote common values and norms, but not too much crime to tear society apart or to create more problems or to hurt too many people. Keeping the right level of crime. Again, hinting that there was a natural balance, a natural equilibrium. Not too much, not too little. Now, Durkheim believed this was true with many forms of social activity. The society was constantly balancing all sorts of different activities, trying to make sure that the overall system was stable and healthy and working properly. At the same time, all this balancing kept everything working together, coordinating things, making sure that all the parts were working together, all the systems and subsystems were cooperating, coordinating their activities, just like a living organism. Well, that pretty much captures everything I want to talk about now with the organism metaphor on functionalism, other than to invite the viewer to kind of play with the metaphor themselves and see if you can think of any other useful analogies between how society works or how it's organized, and how living organisms are organized or how they work. I'm sure if you play around with it a little bit, you can probably come up with some other examples too. But for right now, I just want to point out that our next video will focus on key concerns of functionalism, major concepts, and it'll be our last video in terms of discussing functionalism, the kind of the core, the basics of functionalism. And I guess we'll just see you next time. Thank you.